It was a time of chaos and destruction unlike any other. Yet from its icy waters, features of America's Northwest were forged. The region boasts some of the most diverse and striking landscape in the world. The grandeur of its beauty is rivaled only by the story of its origin. Enthusiasts bill it as the greatest story left untold. It is a story of the Earth's power, scientific discovery, and human nature. I'm Allison Cardival, and this is the tale of how the Northwest was once changed by geologic catastrophe on a biblical scale. It is the story of how it was sculpted by floods. At the heart of the Northwest, you'll find rock formations that resemble those on Mars. However, you'll also find fields representing the richest farmland on Earth. From its heights, grand mountains peak at Heaven's Gate. Yet at its depths, grand coulees bore into bedrock. Within its confines, you can follow the life cycle of water as it seeps from the snowpack, cascades into rivers, and completes its trek to the sea. From forest to high desert, this is America's Northwest. Yet with all its diversity, the origin of these features can all be traced back to one series of events. Events that impacted the landscape on a scale never seen before or since. It is a series of events unique the world over. Scientists say floods so catastrophic in size that they boggle the mind sculpted the finishing touches on this landscape and greatly dictated how people would later live upon it. It was the end of the last ice age, between 12 and 15,000 years ago. The Cordilleran ice sheet held most of what is now Western Canada in its grip and reached down with frozen fingers to grasp parts of Washington, Idaho, and Montana. In a deep mountain valley where the Clark Fork River empties into Lake Pend Oreille, one of these fingers crept across. It plugged the valley with a mountain of glacial ice. The glacier formed an ice dam, and behind it formed an inland sea named Glacial Lake Missoula. As flow from rivers and runoff from the glaciers backed up behind the dam, the waters of Glacial Lake Missoula stretched back for hundreds of miles. Reaching depths of more than 2,000 feet, it turned mountain ranges into islands. At its peak, scientists say that Glacial Lake Missoula held 520 cubic miles of water, making it larger than Lakes Erie and Ontario combined. In time, the ice dam holding back this inland sea would fail.
When the lake got high enough, it would force its way out underneath the ice dam. It would cause the ice dam to eventually to collapse, and most of the lake would end up running out at one time, within 2-3 days perhaps.
With a force 10 times greater than all the world's present rivers combined, the waters of Glacial Lake Missoula burst through this valley above Lake Pend Oreille, beginning a frantic race towards the Pacific Ocean.
During the flood episodes, we would have probably been under thousands of feet of ice here. And compared to the water level in the lake now, which is a little over 2,000 feet, the lake level of Glacial Lake Missoula, which would have been behind us, released over the top of us, the level of that was nearly 4,200 feet. So we're talking about 2,200 feet of water coming right through where we're standing. And of course the ice dam that held that water was even taller than that. It would have been very turbulent water, carrying icebergs, a jumble of rock and huge boulders, sediment carried out of Lake Missoula. It would have been a really turbulent flow.
The water crashed through North Idaho into Washington, inundating the Columbia Basin, carving and gouging the landscape like a liquid knife. Yet during this period, part of the Columbia River's path was usually already blocked by another glacier.
Downstream from Glacial Lake Missoula, there are other glacial lakes dammed, the most important of which was Glacial Lake Columbia. Glacial Lake Columbia was dammed up approximately where Grand Coulee Dam is today. In other words, there was a big lobe of ice, another lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet that came down the Okanagan Valley from Canada to the United States, crossed the Columbia River, went up onto what we call the Columbia Plateau, and by doing that blocked off the Columbia there. So the valley is not completely empty. A third of it or so, let's say, is filled by this existing lake. So only some of the water can be accommodated by the Spokane and Columbia Valley. It fills that valley and spills out where it can, and that's to the south, to other tributaries of the Columbia. In other words, it flows overland, over divides, enters these tributaries, and then starts following them down slope. By a very complicated route, they eventually return to the Snake River, to intermediate basins like Quincy Basin, and eventually to the Columbia.
As the water impatiently waited to pass through the narrows of the Wallula Gap, its only access to the Columbia River Gorge, it backwashed into valleys and actually changed the flow of rivers like the Palouse and Mighty Snake. It roared through the Columbia Gorge, reaching depths of 1,100 feet and speeds up to 70 miles an hour. The water would slow again where Portland, Oregon now stands. Here, the gorge opens up, so the water spread out, but it didn't stop. In the Portland Basin, the Missoula floodwaters descended at a crest of 650 to 360 feet, depths that would leave all but the tallest of Portland's skyscrapers completely underwater. Much of the eastern portion of the city is built on thick sheets of gravel and sand laid down by the floods. This entire ridge along the edge of neighboring Vancouver is actually a giant gravel bar. The frantic wave ventured in vain up the Willamette Valley. There, the turbulent water paused only long enough to deposit soil, gravel, and boulders it had ripped from moorings upstream. Some of these rocks, called erratics, floated in on icebergs from as far away as the mountains of Montana. Still unsatisfied, the water raged on. It followed the gorge past Vancouver and Portland, down the present shipping lanes to Astoria, finally completing its quest to the unfettered confines of the Pacific Ocean. It is a journey that covers 1,000 miles, and yet scientists believe it took only days for the waters of Glacial Lake Missoula to completely drain and reach the sea. There is also evidence to say that this amazing flood happened not just once, but tens, maybe even 100 times, making this series of events the most dramatic floods in the world's history. This is the area where the glacier came across the Clark Fork, sealing the pass and damming the water. On the mountainsides to the northeast, scientists say there is evidence that the dam broke more than once. Trees hide it today, but this photo, taken after fire burned the area in 1910, shows ancient shorelines. They are the parallel lines that run across the mountains.
It's clear from the heights of the lake elevations that we can see on the strand lines that, yes, those did fill to that high point at least several times and then broke out.
How the dam broke is debated, but the most common theory compares it to a phenomenon called jökulhlaups. It's an Icelandic term used to describe outburst floods caused by the rapid release of water from glacier-dammed lakes. This is a jökulhlaup that occurred in Iceland in 1996. The trouble begins whenever a dam is made of ice. Ice is lighter and colder than water. Therefore, the water both melts and floats the ice. Once water gets under the dam, it's only a matter of time before at least part of the structure fails. Keep in mind that this discharge is minuscule compared to what happened at Glacial Lake Missoula.
The valley bottom here is only about a half a mile across, and here all the water that was upstream of us was trying to crowd through this one place. And this is where Pardee calculates that at the height of the flows, that the maximum flow rate would have been about 9.5 cubic miles of water past this point in 1 hour. Now that's a sizable amount of water.
After that, the ice has got this big slot drilled through it, reamed through it by the outburst of water, carried away some of the glacier, perhaps a slot a mile wide, 2,000 feet deep. Glacier is we think of it as a solid, but under a weight of 200 feet of it, it flows, just as all glaciers flow. So immediately, this 200,000-foot wall of ice begins to flow and fill back in this hole again. And probably within a few weeks or months at the most, the ice would merge again. It again seals off the Clark Fork, and Glacial Lake Missoula is right back in business again. So there were many glacial lakes in Missoula over a period of probably 2,500 years or 2,000 years perhaps. Some of them were very large, approximately 520 cubic miles, but others somewhat later. The ice gradually started thinning and very gradually receding out. And so as the ice became a little bit thinner, it was able to dam Glacial Lake Missoula to a little lesser height than it had previously. So the next lake would be a little bit smaller, and the next one after that perhaps a little bit smaller, and so on.
In the wake of these extraordinary deluges, the waters of these Ice Age floods left their unique signature on the landscape of the Northwest. Though clearly visible, it is a signature difficult to read, and it is one scientists are still analyzing to this day. It is hard to imagine the size and force of the events we are talking about. They occurred on a scale unlike anything else on Earth. This is the Clark Fork River as it flows today in Montana. Its course alternates from meandering to breathtaking.
We're really fortunate because no matter what time of the year, there's always good whitewater here, and it's known for having the best late season whitewater around in the Northwest.
This is a vacation paradise where people come to soak in nature's beauty.
The Lower Canyon, we're going to see lots and lots of cedars.
And be exhilarated by its power.
I want to talk about volume. That's how we measure how much water is in a river. And the unit that we use to measure the volume is called CFS, and that stands for cubic feet per second. Right now, the Clark Fork through this area is flowing right around 11,000 CFS. So what that means is from this specific point on this river to right across over here, that's how many cubic feet per second is flowing through here. That's a lot.
Trust me, that's enough to make for a wet ride.
Okay, all forward. Hold on.
These are Class 3 and 4 rapids. Anything larger than Class 5 is considered too dangerous for such joy rides. Yet as impressive as it might be, this is nothing compared to the Great Ice Age floods. During any one of the Great Missoula floods, the canyon in which this river flows was completely filled and overflowing, moving not at 11,000 cubic feet per second, but 500 million cubic feet per second. That is a volume of water not just 60 times greater than the flow of this river, but 60 times greater than the flow of the Amazon. Over the Palouse Falls in southeast Washington, water plummets 185 feet. Though the Palouse River still uses the channel, the cataract was carved out by the Ice Age floods. During large episodes, there was no waterfall here, merely a dimple on the water's surface. That's because at peak flooding, the land on the horizon was covered by more than 150 feet of muddy, debris-filled water. That means the beauty of this and other places along the path of these floods only became apparent after the raging water receded.
Right now, this helicopter is about 1,000 feet above the Columbia River, traveling about 70 miles an hour. At the peak flow of the floods, that's how high and fast the water was traveling down the Columbia Gorge.
The gorge through which the Columbia River passes is 80 miles long and up to 4,000 feet deep, and provides the only sea level route through the Cascade Mountain Range. It was not created by the Ice Age floods. The channel which borders Washington on the north and Oregon on the south was already here for the water to follow. However, its features were altered by the events.
To me, this is one of the most spectacular places because the river is so wide here, and if you can picture that amount of water. I mean, of course, when it's flowing over this surface, we have a place here, you know, where it's going to be relatively quiet up there on the side, but it's probably roaring like hell through the main part of the valley here. And then it gets into a narrower gorge and will speed up a bit as it gets downstream here.
Soil was stripped from side hills and plateaus, and at places where the canyon walls could not confine the water, new channels were carved by the overflow.
We can show, because of this channel, that water clearly was flowing deep enough in the Columbia that the Columbia could not contain it. It had to pond it up at least this level to flow through this channel out of the Columbia and into an adjacent valley.
One of the most dramatic features created by the floods is Dry Falls. Located in central Washington, its cataracts are very similar to those of Niagara Falls. The drop is about 400 feet, twice the height of Niagara Falls. Yet during the peak of the largest floods, scientists say the water was probably about 200 to 300 feet deeper still. That means where I'm standing right now would have been under about 600 feet of water that was churning so violently that it actually quarried the rock face as it went. The flood's turbulent waters quarried gullies and canyons all along its path. The largest of these is Grand Coulee. Here, people can see how events from thousands of years ago impact people's lives today. It's an impact that goes far beyond simply being beautiful. Now blocked with a man-made earthen dam, the Grand Coulee has been turned into a reservoir. Water is pumped from behind Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River. Grand Coulee Dam is a wonder of modern engineering, but it was built here because of the engineering already done by nature. This is the largest concrete dam in North America and is the third largest producer of electricity in the world. In addition, it is the key to a giant land reclamation project. The water stored in this reservoir called Banks Lake helps provide irrigation for some 650,000 acres of farmland throughout the Columbia Basin. The Ice Age floods quarried the coulee that is now Banks Lake. The underlying reason these coulees could be created is due to the material that is the foundation of this land. The bedrock of the inland Northwest is basalt. It was laid down millions of years ago as molten lava. From huge fissures similar to those found in Hawaii, the lava flowed across the lowlands in giant sheets to form the Columbia Plateau. Called the Columbia River Basalt Group, these flows cover 63,000 square miles and at points are 3 miles thick. As basalt cools, it cracks, often to form columns. The stone is heavy and strong, but the cracks make it easy to quarry. This means that during one Missoula flood event, entire new canyons could be formed. The turbulent waters would rip away boulders, rolling them on ahead. The force would grind portions of these boulders into gravel and deposit them in massive bars along the way.
This material is like you would find sand and gravel today around the boulders after the high water mark of the spring have died down. So what we have up here are boulder and cobble and large sand size materials making up all those materials you see on that hillside. Here's where the scale comes in, of course. The boulders in this case are mountainsides, and the material filling in between those boulders is boulder itself. And so you have to just kind of scale your mind up to the force of the water and what must have been going on to allow that size of material to be transported.
The force of the water would also rip away topsoil from one area, then redistribute it downstream. The fertile farmland in Oregon's Willamette Valley coaxed settlers west, but only because the floods came first. The rich topsoil that inspired pioneers to brave the Oregon Trail was dumped here during the floods. The Ice Age floods ravaged this land between 12 and 15,000 years ago. But with no historical records to draw from, how do we really know what happened? Well, that's a question geologists have been trying to answer for more than 60 years. There are signs of the flood's handiwork throughout the Northwest, but seeing them for what they really are can be tricky. For example, looking at this overview, it is fairly easy to see what appears to be the remnant of braided riverbeds. They follow the topography of the land in a manner similar to any ordinary stream. In fact, they in themselves might seem quite unextraordinary until you realize their size. This is an overview from space, and what looks to be a dry riverbed covers all of central Washington. This is the same area pioneering farmers took to calling the scablands because of the barren patches of bedrock scattered amongst their fertile fields. Stripped of its topsoil, the wounded land served them as nothing but an eyesore. The first geologists to venture out into Washington's scablands did not have the benefit of overviews from the air, let alone space. They had to tromp around this rugged terrain on foot and from ground level try and figure out what its features mean. Since this story covers 4 states, you can understand why it was not discovered all at once, but rather chapter by chapter. Geologist J. Harlan Bretz is the person most commonly associated with discovering the Ice Age flood story. He first became interested in the subject after seeing a topographical map of Quincy Basin shortly before World War I.
It looked to him like a huge Niagara Falls. It was that kind of topography, a double and arcuate thing, 2 of them with an island in between. So it looked like American Falls, Canadian Falls, a Goat Island in between. Downstream from it, a gorge, analogous to Niagara Gorge below the falls. What on earth is this doing here? This is way out on the edge of Quincy Basin. There's no water here. There's never been any water here, I don't think. But if not, why is this here?
It was a decade later before he first actually came to this area in the 1920s. But seeing the landscape firsthand only reinforced his inclination that the origin was water-caused.
Sometimes if you dry up a river and look at the riverbed when it's dry, you can see some of these features on a very miniature scale. But here they were, 10 times larger than anything you could ever see in a river. And some of them in places where there's no water today. But he could, from just the shape of them, the geomorphology, he used that to infer flood.
Yet the overwhelming size was hard even for Bretz to take in all at one time.
The very first paper he published, early 1923, which was as a result of the fieldwork he'd done in the summer of 1922, it doesn't appear that he appreciated how big the water was. A year later, he went back in the summer of 1923. Somewhere along the line during that field season, a light came on. He said, this area is so huge, it's continuous. I need water at least 200 feet deep here. I do there too, and there too. These must have been flowing simultaneously. This is colossal. This is colossal water. So by the time the second paper comes along in 1923, the field evidence has forced him into this interpretation of a large flood that he called the Spokane flood.
Bretz also referred to central Washington as the channeled scablands. When he first proposed that its unique features were the result of a gigantic flood, Bretz's colleagues were less than supportive.
Bretz was discriminated against by the scientific community. There was kind of a ruling hypothesis about the way ice and glaciers had formed those channels in other ways, and they really weren't very open to his scientific methodology.
Well, that gets into a religious, social, and political thing here. We do have politics and science. That's interesting. We had come through a period of time when geology was being developed in the mid-1800s, and then finally in the early teens, or part of the century, it came kind of into fruition. And one of the things that this science really based its basic tenet was very slow changes. And we kind of looked at it from that standpoint, the science did, that things just didn't happen catastrophically.
It's called uniformitarianism. meaning the landscapes we look at today are the results of the geologic processes we see occurring day in and day out, consistently over extremely long periods of time. A dramatic example of this is the Grand Canyon. This theory had just recently unseated catastrophism, which explained the formation of the Earth's features by far more violent and expedient means.
I think they felt they had established themselves in legitimate science and had a lot to offer society. And they just didn't want to see any erosion of their position in time there at that particular moment. And it was very disconcerting to them to have somebody come in and say, hey, look, we have these landforms out there that were created by this big flood of water. And, you know, when we told everybody it was just slow river work and everything like this.
I think a lot of times egos get involved in science, and these are some pretty powerful people that he was up against. Very important people in universities as well as the U.S. Geological Survey, and people don't like to have their minds changed very easily when they've advocated things in publications and ideas in meetings, and they kind of lose face. But also there's this evolution in science of ideas, and once an idea becomes in vogue, a lot of people follow it to the point of not questioning it.
The other main reason many had a problem with Bretz's theory was the fact that he did not provide a source for this colossal, havoc-wreaking water. During this same time period, other scientists were working on aspects of this story too. Even before Bretz entered the field, Joseph Pardee, considered a very thorough geologist, had gathered evidence that a great inland sea had existed in Montana, a sea called Glacial Lake Missoula.
Mount Jumbo, the very upper part of it would have been an island.
A sea whose shorelines are still visible on the hillsides that surround the city of Missoula, Montana.
Over here is Mount Sentinel and the famous M, and I believe it's something like, 680 some feet up to the M up there. But anyway, you get a good view this morning. I'm really impressed with the light shadows were just perfect in here. Yeah. And you can see the strand lines going up there. Obviously, the lake went up and stayed at a certain elevation for long enough to form that and moved up and down who knows how many times. Pardee did his work here in 1910, the first publication, and Bretz came through this part of the world for going out to do the research in the teens, the early 19-teens in Washington State. And he must have obviously read some of the stuff that Pardee wrote about, but he never made the connection between the Glacial Lake Missoula story that Pardee gave in 1910 to his part of the problem out there, explaining where the water came from.
When Bretz was under attack by the geologic community, Pardee wrote him a letter suggesting that his lake might prove to be the water source for Bretz's flood. But for reasons unknown, Bretz did not try to connect the two.
This letter that Pardee wrote him in 1925 in June, 6 weeks after his paper was published, in which Bretz stumbled to try to explain where the water came from. And Pardee told him where it probably came from, Glacial Lake, Missoula, but Bretz ignored it. It wasn't his idea. He didn't believe it. He was more interested in the field evidence, so what? But he got criticized. I don't think Bretz realized how important it was to other people to know where the water came from. He just seemed not to care all the way through this whole thing. If he could just supply an adequate source of the water, his story would make a great deal more sense. It would be believable. And until an adequate source of water that can be delivered fast is presented, there's always going to be skeptics and big skeptics. So I think Bretz was pretty stubborn as an individual, it's almost like being blind to something that's so important to his story. And I mean, it's interesting. I don't know why he did this, but he's a human being, and we all are, and we all miss things. And I don't know, maybe there's a personality problem with this person or another, but scientists are people, just as we don't always look at things as objectively as people from the outside think we might. We're constrained by our own times, and we're constrained by our own personalities and those of other people around us, and we're just as much human beings as anybody else.
Being human himself, without proof that Glacial Lake Missoula had drained in a dramatic fashion, Pardee was not willing to go against Bretz's powerful critics.
Pardee worked in the U.S. Geological Survey, a government employee, and he had a couple people above him that really did not like Bretts that well. And of course, as we know, the Depression was ongoing in the 30s, and one wouldn't want to find themselves out on the street at that point in time.
So, undaunted by his lack of support, Bretts referred to his mysterious water as the Spokane Flood and continued to document the features he was certain it had created.
Large bodies of moving water really can do incredible things. And while walking on a beach, it's easy to identify things like ripple marks, features created by water waves washing back into the ocean over the sand. But what if the ripples were the size of sand dunes? And instead of being found along a beach, you found them somewhere in central Washington or western Montana without a drop of water in sight.
That is exactly what Joseph Pardee found during his field studies in the late 1930s.
He was poking around the western end of Glacial Lake Missoula in 1939 especially, and started noticing things he hadn't noticed earlier.
What he noticed still fascinates people to this day.
This is the pivotal piece of information here that really swung the court of public, or in this case, a scientific opinion, in favor of Bretts and Bretts' theories about the floods.
Camas Prairie in Montana, he found an area that had these quite spectacular series of mounds, but actually they're elongated mounds, and when you get up high and look on them, maybe you'd seen them from the air even, they look very much like ripple marks in the floor of a stream. Only instead of being inches apart and inches high, they were hundreds of feet apart and tens of feet high, huge things. And the whole field of them extending some miles, 2 or 3 miles, all of them seemed to emanate out of a pass. And when he went up to the pass, it looked like big water had gone through it. And he was beginning to get onto the idea that these areas were scarred by water.
So this was kind of the thing that people couldn't ignore. How else can you explain these ripple forms without explaining the fact that we had a fast draining of water?
So it was evidence that the lake had failed suddenly, was on its way out very fast to produce this. And the complementary evidence, he found many places downstream with these, what he called eddy bars, or some term like that, high up on the flanks of the Flathead Valley and the Clark Fork Valley. So he wrote a paper on all of this. The title was one of the great understatements of geology. The title was Unusual Currents in Glacial Lake Missoula.
It was 1940 in the city of Seattle when vindication for Bretts would begin. That is when Pardee presented his findings at a meeting of the Geological Society of America.
This is the interesting thing. Pardee never really referred to Bretts directly in the conference in 1940 or in his paper directly. It was kind of an offhanded way of laying out the evidence and support.
The session was held on the afternoon of Tuesday, June 18th. One of Bretts' biggest detractors, Richard Foster Flint of Yale University, was there. Early in the session, he presented a well-prepared synopsis of his arguments that the origin of the channeled scablands were non-cataclysmic. Though he had never been to see the field evidence, Flint's theory that these features were created by the normal process of channel aggradation was highly supported by his audience. Then Joseph Pardee prepared to speak about the ripple marks in Glacial Lake Missoula.
Pardee got up, he was a very poor speaker, weak speaker, nervous as a presenter, but he got up and started talking about this evidence that he'd seen from Glacial Lake Missoula. As he went on, people started rustling their papers and started listening, and at the end, he presented this evidence of the giant current ripples, these big sands, and the interpretation that it had been a big flow of water there. There was just sort of silence in the end, and then gradually people started clapping, and they stood up, and they gave him a standing ovation, because they realized, the significance of this, that this argument of this, this Bretts with the big water versus these other people with more gradualist explanations had become a popular argument, a famous argument in the geologic literature. And here is the piece of evidence that was going to break the story.
Yet it would take years for the evidence to become widely accepted. The process was slowed by the distraction of the Second World War and the fact that it was still difficult to travel to the region where the richest field evidence was located. It wasn't until the 1950s that Bretz himself returned to the field with colleagues George Neff and Dan Livenbelt. Then nearly 70, this would be Bretz's last summer of field work in the channeled scablands.
So after that summer, Bretz and these other two people published a paper in 1956, almost 100 pages long, in great detail, going back over the evidence that he had supplied earlier, showing the new evidence, refuting these other interpretations, and also showing photographs like these giant current ripples or current dunes on the surface of some of these bars. The type of evidence that once anybody sees it, it's very hard to believe to imagine there could be any other explanation than a huge flood. So it's a critical piece of visual evidence that was missing in the early story. It was there all along, but it just wasn't known or presented. And then finally, because Pardee had presented a good, adequate, scientifically documented source of water, there was that problem solved too. So after the 1956 paper, it more or less squelched argument anymore, and everybody, except maybe a few diehards, accepted the idea that there was a Spokane flood, a big, huge Spokane flood.
For his work, Bretz was ultimately rewarded with the highest honor his science has to offer, but it was a long time coming. It was 1979 when Bretz was awarded the Penrose Medal, and finally overcame the long-standing rejection of his peers.
Bretz lived with this rejection essentially then from 1927 to about the mid-60s, 40-some years. And from that standpoint, I think it was a lesson to the sciences to how to approach things and to be more accepting. And I think that's a very important lesson for all of us to take a look at.
Another lesson to be learned is that it is rare for one person to be solely responsible for figuring out a scientific puzzle of this magnitude.
Well, certainly they were pioneers in what they observed, but I think often we tend to give some scientists more credit than others, and we have to remember that science is a collective effort. There are pieces to the puzzle, and who knows what piece is more important than another. Bretz is given major credit for it, and of course Pardee, his research on the lake. But there were others around that time who made contributions too, and they've kind of been lost in the literature through the years.
It took years for Bretz and Pardee's theories to intertwine, and even longer for their scientific community to accept. But their findings are not the end. They are merely the beginning of a tale that continues to unfold.
The maximal floods were 520 cubic miles of water running through the system in a few days, 2 or 3 days.
Every year, geologists, both professional and amateur, return to examine field evidence, and it is from this scrutiny that the story continues to evolve. For the most part, Bretz had lobbied that this flood, this marvel of nature, had occurred only once. That in a matter of days, the waters of the floods had created spectacular features such as dry falls and Grand Coulee. Even advocates of the flood idea found this hard to believe, again, simply because of the scale. For example, if there was only one flood, that would mean that this coulee leading to the Dry Falls Cataract, which is some 17 miles in length, was created in a 3-day period.
But now we know that even during the last glaciation alone, there was at least 89, probably 100 floods, something like that. And so if you break down the same distance that way, each flood, during each flood, the falls only has to retreat a few hundred yards during any one of them. You add them up, and then it comes up, you can get you 17 miles that way. So it becomes much more believable. I mean, Niagara Falls has retreated considerably in historic time, just with that little dinky flow of water going, I mean, dinky compared to this.
Much like them structurally.
Richard Waite has been studying the flood story for decades. He and another scientist named Brian Atwater contributed greatly to the next chapter of the flood story that unfolded in the late 1970s. This chapter begins by looking at layers of dirt.
It's a subscience we call stratigraphy, the study of strata, study of layers. And this is what I encountered when I first started going to some of these valleys, especially the Walla Walla Valley. in the late 1970s. I saw these layers. By now, of course, I'm sort of trained in this subdiscipline, and many of us are, and the science had developed enough that you no longer just ignore them. You're intrigued by them, and what's producing these beautiful, sort of even look-alike layers, one after another.
Through his study of the evidence, Richard Waite became convinced that these layers were formed during what Bretz called the Great Spokane Flood. But Waite felt instead of one event, there had been numerous floods. His findings suggest that the waters of glacial Lake Missoula had raged to the sea perhaps 100 different times.
Walla Walla Valley has many deposits like this that are layered. The valley's full of it. And when you look at any one section, you can see that there's coarse parts and finer parts of the bed. In detail, a bed will grade up from very coarse at the bottom to finer and finer at top. And what this implies is that there was a very vigorous, they're all water-laid sediments. And what it implies is the current was very vigorous at the beginning and got more gradual and more gradual. Also, the sediments, the light parts of them, are clearly from the Columbia River, coming in from the Columbia River, not coming down the Walla Walla Valley, which is surrounded by dark basalt and would have entirely dark sediment in it. Each one of these beds is a record of a separate giant flood coming from Columbia River, back flooding up the Walla Walla, filling the whole valley, and then gradually draining out.
Today, this theory is widely accepted, but in the 1980s, Waite felt a little like Bretz had years before.
It's widely accepted, but not universally. At first, it was very controversial. I mean, it was probably as controversial as Bretz's at first. There was no supporters at first. I mean, I felt that way, and there was a lot of criticism against it, and other people sort of rushed out to sort of come up with another idea. But the field evidence, though, if you look at it carefully, I don't think there was any other good interpretation you could make on it. Some people tried, but it just didn't really work.
The latest discoveries connected to the floods support the multiple event theory. However, to see it, you have to go to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean.
Typically, when a river flows into the ocean, the river water is less dense than the seawater. And because of that, all of the mud that's flowing with the river tends to remain at the top. If you drive along the west coast of the United States after a storm has gone through, you will see a muddy plume on the surface of the ocean out in front of where the major streams and rivers come in.
However, during flood conditions, when the amount of suspended sediment is very high and the water is particularly cold, the river water can actually become more dense than the seawater.
And in those conditions, the flow will keep moving along the bottom. It will act as if it's in a river channel and move on downslope. And it just so happens that offshore of the Columbia River, there are several submarine canyons. And during the time of lowered sea level, which is when these floods occurred, when enough water from the ocean was locked up in ice on the continents that sea level was more than 100 meters below where it is now, there were canyons immediately offshore that this flood from the Columbia River could move into. Once the turbid flow, this turbidity current, is in the canyon, it's on a fairly steep slope, and so gravity will easily keep pulling it downhill. Once it gets out onto the deep sea floor, through many earlier flows of probably regular turbidity currents, there's a channel there, and so the flows will follow this channel.
The only thing on land that compares to turbidity currents in terms of destructive nature and speed are pyroclastic flows, which occur during volcanic eruptions. Both sweep down slope, wiping out anything in their path. While the floods from glacial Lake Missoula traveled about 1,000 miles over land, deep-sea core samples now indicate its course continued at least that far again along the ocean floor. Sediment from the Ice Age floods has now been identified off the coast of California.
It's hard to even put a ballpark estimate on how much of the turbidity currents that were generated by the flood events is in Escanaba Trough, but it could be just a fraction of a percent or a few percent at most, and that the bulk of the Missoula flood debris is now resting well out on the Pacific Plate. Well, we've identified 12 events which are separated by these hemipelagic layers of basically clay, and it's from those clay layers that we can do the dating of the beds. And we suspect that we are not seeing a complete record of all of the flooding that took place from Glacial Lake Missoula. Rather, only the largest of the events generated turbidity currents that were overflowing the channel outside of the Blanco fracture zone with enough material in that overflow to make it all the way south into Escanaba Trough. So our view of the floods is that we can see the largest events, but how many smaller events died out or stayed confined within the channel, we don't know.
Is go back to 135.
As scientists look to the future for further discoveries, it's becoming clear that how and where people live in the Northwest is determined greatly by events that took place in the last ice age.
Well, the floods in northern Idaho, together with the ice, actually have created the whole landscape as we know it today. We're living in a landscape that was created during the Pleistocene ice age, whether it be sculpted from the floods or sculpted from the ice, and created many of the lakes as well as the aquifers that people use for drinking water.
The best example of an aquifer created in the flood's activities is near Spokane, Washington, under the Rathdrum Prairie and Spokane Valley. This is an area located right in the upper path of the floodwaters.
It's a relatively narrow constriction here, as narrow as it gets, which is still several miles wide. Upon exiting this valley, it pours out into the Spokane Valley Rathdrum area and covers a larger area, so it spreads out, loses some energy, and starts depositing these gravel deposits. And those are the gravels that today form the aquifer for the whole region. Essentially 400,000 plus people are using that aquifer for their drinking water.
The aquifer itself impacts everyday life here, especially as time rolls on. There's more and more people dependent on that water supply. You see it in the papers almost every day about who's doing what over the aquifer and what the rules are, what the regulations are, what company might be doing something, what park might be doing something, how it's affecting the fisheries downstream, because the water is always affected, both the surface water and the water in the gravel.
The debris layers deposited by the floods are also responsible for creating the area's numerous and favorite recreation sites.
All the lakes in the valley, Coeur d'Alene, Hayden, Newman, Hauser, Twin, Spirit, all those lakes are dammed by flood material. They have no exits, surface exits by streams as such. They pour into the underground aquifer and recharge the gravels. So that those are that's the source of the water in the aquifer. The Coeur d'Alene Lake discharges into the Spokane River, but also if you look at the Spokane River, there's sections hydrologically where it loses water into the gravels and also gains water out of the gravels. So it's the only one that has a full-time river exit.
Another large body of water in North Idaho that is tied directly to the floods is Lake Pend Oreille. During the era of the floods, the lake's basin was filled with glacier ice.
The lake basin itself is what we call a fjord. It was actually scoured out by a combination of floodwaters and ice. And up until recently, it wasn't quite understood how deep the basin was to bedrock. The water is between 1,100 to 1,200 feet deep, just to the bottom of the present basin. We now know from seismic data collected from the Navy here that there are over 1,000 to 1,500 feet more of sediments in the bottom of the lake. So that puts the rock basin of this lake up to several hundred feet below present sea level. So it's one of the deepest lakes in North America.
In fact, it is so deep that the United States Navy has a facility here where it conducts submarine tests.
Here we are in this beautiful playground where everybody likes to park and recreate, as I say, and it's caused by the Ice Age floods. That's the significant thing to me. very narrow point of view. I mean, there's also, of course, lots of other things that it affected for people, but my specialty is parks and recreation, so that's really important. And you can see it by the amount of tourists and the tourist industry we have here, all the fun that everybody has.
Besides the recreational fun, remnants from the floods help determine things like transportation systems. Highways and railroads are laid out along pathways chiseled into the landscape by the floodwaters. Plus, the immense and numerous gravel deposits left behind impact the region's choice of construction material.
We have an abundance of sand and gravel in the flood areas right here. On the other hand, it isn't available once the areas are developed, so it's a resource that has to be managed as well as protected, or we end up importing gravel. There are places in the country that don't have aggregate resources, and then what do you do for your concrete and roads and asphalt, etc.?
Though its features were created by events that took place more than 10,000 years ago, people are still discovering what stories this land holds, how to interpret them, and what they mean to us.
I think you can carry the science beyond just a level of interest to the public. We've learned a lot about resources in this area. We know a lot more about the aquifer. We know a lot more about the sand and gravel resources. We know about the limiting situations on the aquifer. We know that there's stratigraphy in it. It's not just one homogeneous sponge, as it's been called. There's always offshoots of science that you can't explain at that point that you're studying.
Some of those applications have proven to be otherworldly. The Pathfinder was tested in the scablands of central Washington to help determine if it was ready to venture to the surface of Mars. What's been learned about the Missoula floods has also been used to examine geologic scenarios that might have occurred on Mars and other planets.
In fact, they came here to Farragut and looked at the origin of the flood. They gained a lot of information using it as a planetary analogy for what they might experience on Mars.
Yet even here on Earth, the education continues, often while people are just enjoying the lay of the land.
Of all the people that come here to do those things in North Idaho, I would say probably 2% of them might know a little bit about the Ice Age floods at this point. The story is not out there. And when I talk to someone about it for more than a 30-second blip, they're very interested and they start, well, I want to know more about that. Or you can see the look in their eye that they're going to go find out or go read the displays that we have or the books that we have for sale. Everybody's interested in it. Once they get the grasp of the size of this flood, it's just awesome.
In order to determine how to effectively tell the story to the public, the government has just recently completed an extensive study on the Ice Age floods.
The challenge of the Ice Age floods is the size. It's humongous. It goes across 4 states, and big states at that: Montana, Idaho a little bit, and Washington mostly, and part of Oregon. To cover that kind of territory takes a tremendous amount of coordination and knowledge and people and travel and communication. So it's quite the challenge just to get everybody together on it, and it's taken a lot of time.
The goal of this study is to ensure the different agencies and people involved across the 4 states can tell a coordinated story.
This is a new type of situation where you have a nationally significant thing, or flood in this case, across 4 states. So what are you going to call it or name it? It's not a national park, it's not a national monument. It's decided to be called the Ice Age Floods National Geologic Region at this point. Now, Congress can change that.
The story itself can change as well.
Yes, definitely. There are debates about this scientific phenomenon that are as intense now as they were then. Hopefully they're more objective now, and all the participants and workers have learned from the past and then we aren't going to have the same kind of issues come up again. I mean, that would be the irony of the whole situation, that we recreate the kind of situation that we've had in the past with Brits.
Unlike the formations it studies, the science of geology is not set in stone. With new discoveries and the development of new technology, the story of the Ice Age floods will continue to evolve. And with that, the appreciation of the legacy they have left the Northwest can continue to grow.